This conference marks a very special point in the history of the cooperation of the Baltic Conservators. 30 years of cooperation, that is something. And I'm very, very happy and very honored that I'm invited to speak here on that occasion. This year at Easter time, my family came over from Germany to Amsterdam to visit me. And what do you do if your family visits you? You entertain them. So we decided to go to a museum. And as soon as we decided that, the children started to panic and said, "Oh no, museums are so boring. Mama, please, do we have to stay there for long?" I don't know. It's typical reaction for Dutch and for German children. I don't know how the Baltic children react, but typical. Okay. We decided to visit. We decided to visit the Museum of Canals. That is quite a new museum. It opened its doors in 2011. It is that building here, this one, with the flag of Amsterdam with the 3 St. Andrew crosses in front. It tells the story of the canals of Amsterdam.
Amsterdam got to know the world, and the world Amsterdam. But there's a problem. Our success is threatening to become our ruin. There's an increasing wave of immigrants to the city, wealthy tradesmen who want to be at the center of power, but also refugees and outcasts. So what now? The city is crammed with people again. Something must happen. Additional space must be created. Otherwise, consequences will be disastrous.
Gentlemen, we have a big problem. Our old city is bursting at the seams, and more people are coming to live here. We need new harbours, new houses, a new city, much larger than what we have now, and one that won't be crowded again a few years from now.
Something special happened because we all agreed we liked that museum. And my family, that is an art historian, an archivist, my daughter of 17 years and my nephew of 13 years and me, we all liked that museum. And even after some days, we could repeat what we have learned. So that triggered my interest. What makes that museum so nice in comparison to a traditional museum? Why is that museum so attractive to the young generation? In a traditional museum, you are expected to have contextual knowledge. So the museum will provide you with very few information. Beside an artwork, you have the label, but look how few information you get with the artwork. And for larger exhibitions, you are provided with a little folder, which gives a little bit more background information, or you get an audio tour. Also, you spend a lot of time standing. That results in back pain. And you're sometimes very happy if you can just sit down and relax. The Museum of the Canals has a different approach. They don't expect you to have any knowledge, and they put education first. And we just heard the director of the National Museum of Estonia. He said it's precisely the same here in this very new museum. Education is a central key point. And how do they transfer the knowledge? They actively involve the public. So you walk around, you look, they also involve all senses. So when the museum explained how the canal houses were built, you walked on sand. And here in that room where they show the little doll's house with all the different people who once lived in that house, you hear the music, you hear people talk. So it's a very interactive way of knowledge transfer. But most importantly, they tell a story. And journalists know a good story contains the 5 W's. The who, what, where, when, and why. And the 1 H for the how. And if you ask now, and what has that to do with me as a conservator? It's the H of how, it's the H of heritage. Because artists, and Cormo said dead people are dead. Usually artists which are exhibited in our museums, unfortunately, are dead, but they leave traces on the heritage, on artworks. History leaves traces. There are wars, there are floods, even the daily use just leaves traces, and we conservators can read those traces. We have a very intimate relation to artworks because during the hours of varnish removal, dry cleaning, or tear mending, we get a relation to an object. But we learn a lot while working on objects, but usually we tend to hide it in boring conservation reports. But I want to show you another way, what we can learn from traces if we are able to read them. I just use an example from my own field of experience, heritage on paper. So here we see a drawing by Vincent van Gogh. We examined it during a research project on the drawings of Vincent van Gogh. When he drew it, Van Gogh was 35 years old. He left Paris that year in February. He was ill, he was quite unsatisfied, and he longed for the sun of the south. So he went to Arles. In spring, he just finished to paint his blossoming trees, and he made this drawing. When we look at this drawing in transmitted light, we see that the upper edge is different. The paper is, I have to say, here the screen is going on and off and on and off. That's a little bit disturbing. Can you either put it off or on? Yeah, it's really disturbing because, yeah. So the paper is locally thinner. It looks like if an old mending was removed. But we know that there are more drawings of Van Gogh of the same size and the same paper quality. And if we look at artists' catalogs, we see that there are solid sketch blocks were sold. Here's an American catalog from 1885, so it's contemporary to Van Gogh. And if we convert the inches into centimeters, we see that the size precisely matches the drawing. And we can imagine that Van Gogh used a solid sketch block for drawing. We wanted to know how Van Gogh was drawing. So how did he build up a drawing? So which lines come first, which lines are on top of what? So we studied the stratigraphy of lines, and we wanted to know which drawing instruments he used. So we studied the line morphology and the thickness of the lines. Here you see a little detail of the drawing. You see some ink lines of different density on top of each other, and underneath you see pencil lines. Oops, sorry, excuse me. You see pencil lines. Some follow the image, but there's also this straight line. So in this infrared reflectogram, we see the pencil sketch, and if we enhance the contrast a little bit, we see some more lines appearing here, here, and here. So what can that be? These are traces of a perspective frame. And here is a drawing of Van Gogh, which he made in 1882. Of his perspective frame, he describes what that means to use a perspective frame. He says, on the beach or in a meadow or a field, you have a view as if through a window. The lines of the frame, together with the diagonals and the cross, provide a clear guide to some of the principal features, so that one can make a drawing with a firm hand, setting out the broad outlines and proportions. And that's precisely what he did in the drawing. 6 years later, he still continued to use a perspective frame. He did not use that one, actually. He used just a normal stretcher, put some ropes around it, and used that as a perspective frame. And we know that he used perspective frame for drawing outside. So first, he put the stretcher on top of the paper, outlined the perspective frame. We see some lines are very clear and solid because that is the wooden stretcher, and some other lines are a little bit wobbly. That's because the ropes just moved a little bit. So first he makes the outlines of the perspective frame, then he starts to draw with a pencil. Then he continues to use ink, and he uses a metal dip pen of a size of 0.3 millimeters. That matches an extra fine metal dip pen. And he outlines just the horizontal region. So he starts with the horizon, works towards the foreground. Then he changes his pen. He uses one of 0.5 millimeter. Works furthermore towards the foreground. And again, change of the pen, works with 1.5 millimeter. That is not a metal dip pen anymore. The morphology shows us that he used a reed pen. And reed is very common in south of France, so it was cheap for him to get reed pens and use them. So you see, he filled the entire foreground with pen strokes. And finally, he added depth. So you see, he creates really beautifully this depth, and he puts detail. And that he does with darker ink. And this means that he beforehand used diluted ink. I was wondering if he would do the pencil sketch outside and then go back to the yellow house, to his studio there, and finish the drawing with ink there. Because taking an ink pot with you is quite dangerous, because it can spill and then you have the ink all over, and ink is very difficult to remove from textiles. The paper conservators amongst you might have realized that this drawing has a little strange pattern. It is especially in the region of the sky. I hope you can see it. Yeah. So these are little droplets. They are distributed all over the drawing. You see them easily in the region of the sky, but also here. They dissolved the ink locally, and they are even on the darkest areas of the ink. So any idea what that could be? Yes, it's rain, and that is the proof that he really worked outside. So I really needed that proof to believe that he worked outside with ink, but that's rain proof. And finally, we wanted to know which ink he used, because we wanted to know how was the drawing originally looking like. Was it actually a monochrome brown drawing, or was it monochrome, or which color had the drawing? So we took a little ink sample. We recently developed this little sampling technique that allows to take very, very, very tiny surface samples of ink and analyze them further. We did that for the inorganic part with SEM EDX, and for the organic part with liquid chromatography. And we found that he used a chrome Lockwood ink. That's a typical ink for the second half of the 19th century. Chrome Lockwood ink. And there was a dye added, a purple dye, methyl violet dye. And a chrome Lockwood ink has a dark, a dark gray color. And if you add a little bit of purple, it gets this beautiful purple glow. So the ink was not, or the drawing was not brown originally, it was colored. It has this grayish, dark, blackish color with a purple glow. And we know how chrome Lockwood ink changes over time. It's changing color towards brown. That happens within a period of 80 to 100 years, and independent of light, actually. And methyl violet, the dye, is very light sensitive, so that will fade out over time. So we could understand the change the drawing underwent until today, and we can even make a prediction how the drawing will develop in the future by analyzing the ink. Finally, Van Gogh also made a painting of that special view. And if you see, and actually the drawing and the painting have the same size. So the first thing you would think is, okay, he first made a drawing and then he transferred it to the painting. But there's a big difference. You see, huh? It's the horizontal line is a different perspective. I was quite puzzled. But then I realized that when he made the painting, he already had sent the drawing to his brother Theo. But the difference in perspective comes because when he draws, he's sitting. When he's painting, he's standing. That explains that difference. So I hope that once in your lifetime you will see this drawing somewhere in an exhibition, and then the label beside it might say it's Vincent van Gogh, a landscape with farmhouses, Arles 1888, and the size, and that's it. But I hope that you will remember and that you will see that Van Gogh was walking out of Arles, having his sketch block under his arm, wearing having his perspective frame with him, having some drawing tools, and I hope you will hear the birds singing and the bees buzzing, and you will remember that while he was making the drawing, it started to rain. The public is very interested in learning how art is made. The Van Gogh Museum organized a big exhibition on atelier practice of Van Gogh in 2013. It was crowded. Okay, the Van Gogh Museum is always crowded, but it was very crowded at this exhibition. And the public could touch and feel materials that artists use, and they could play around with the perspective frame. So the museum educators even won a prize with that concept. Another successful way of knowledge transfer is done by the Royal Library in The Hague. They have the museum night, and the conservators there, they actively involve the public in parchment making, paper making, ink making, and I just learned you had the museum night last weekend here in Tartu. And there were also a lot of visitors visiting the archives, the museums, and so the public is interested. And we conservators can have an active part in that. So I'm sure there are a lot of nice examples in the Baltic countries. The ICOM statutes of 2007 state that the mission of heritage institutes is to strive to disclose values by acquisition, conservation, research, communication and exhibition of the heritage for the purposes of education, study, and I like that most, enjoyment. So what is our function as conservators? Keeping or forming values. Most conservators would probably see the core of their actions as keeping heritage values, conserving them. This is very important because we want to keep heritage accessible for future generations. But values are not static. Values change, and each of our decision, each treatment, each decision to send something to an exhibition changes the values. What if the future generation is not interested in heritage? How can we bond? How can we make a link between heritage and people? And then here I want to draw your attention to another point, the communication of values. If we want to keep heritage, people, especially the young generation, should feel in love with heritage, should feel responsible. And there we are back at the how, the age, the convey of values, telling stories is crucial, and our profession has important story to tell, how heritage was made. And if we don't tell it, who else will tell that story? Participation in the communication of values makes us a partner to other professions in the museum involved in communication of values that are art historians, historians, and museum educators. And we don't do that work alone. The best way is to include a team, to work in multidisciplinary teams. And here's the team with whom I worked when we studied the Van Gogh drawings. So that are my colleagues. Han Nevel, he is a chemist and specialist in inks, art. He is specialist in natural and synthetic dyes and liquid chromatography. Frank, he's a color scientist and physicist. Marij Vellekoop, she is head of research in the Van Gogh Museum and wrote the Van Gogh catalogus of the Van Gogh, drawings of the Van Gogh Museum. Tayo Medendorp is Van Gogh specialist, art historian. He wrote the catalogus on the early drawings of Van Gogh. I know that all of you already have a heavy workload. You organize big digitization projects. you organize exhibitions, you manage loans, you conserve, you preserve the heritage. And but I want to make one point. Besides keeping, informing heritage, we have another responsibility to communicate values. Together, we work on the general mission to give a past to the future and to give a future to the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. Do we have any questions? Yes.
Hello, and thank you for the presentation. I'm totally up with you, and I totally agree with what you're saying. The question, though, might be a little bit difficult. What would you say to the group of children in Van Gogh Museum that don't differ between original artwork and illustration in a catalogue?
What is your question precisely? What I would say to the children, what is the difference between the original artwork? Is that the question?
Because they don't differ, they don't see the difference.
It is the screen generation. It is absolutely true. And I think this is very difficult to convey precisely that information. I think
it's not 2 minutes answer, probably.
people who do art, children who are painting, they will understand.
Yeah, I know. I'm with you totally. I was so flabbergasted quite often that I couldn't find the words. The only word I could explain them, because no technology explanation, no technique, no time consumption would explain to them what's the value of the original and what's the value of the illustration in a book. The only value they could have understood, it was like a monetary value. So when you said that this original cost as much as 10,000 catalogue books, then they suddenly started piling them in their imagination and started to understand it. But without that, we couldn't find the words.
I wonder if you should convey that with words, or if we should put them on a table drawing or painting. Because then they understand that it's time-consuming, then they understand it's not easy. So making a copy of a part of an original, I think that conveys the idea of what drawing is, what painting is, how time-consuming, how beautiful it can be, how much fun it can make. Yeah. But I wonder if we can convey it with words. Thank you for the question. I don't have a real answer.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the time is over.